Can we start with jobs? Unite, the union, last week were talking about going into bat for the lorry drivers and making the point that, yes, they need better pay, but they also need things like better toilet stops and better catering facilities at roadside stops. It's a classic example, isn't it, of the sort of issue Labour ought to be getting behind. It's not a return to 1970s-style union militancy. It's reasonable. It's what somebody who drives a lorry deserves.
That is absolutely right. We have seen, particularly over the last 10 years, I think, a race to the bottom on terms and conditions for all sorts of different workers. Salaries have been knocked down. People's work and terms and conditions at work have been defined really by that race to the bottom. And a big part of that is because we have seen a weakening trade union movement in this country. The purpose of a trade union movement is to engage with the employer, to negotiate on a sectoral basis to ensure that workers are treated fairly and decently. And that's right at the heart of our report, based on conversations with 60 people who used to vote Labour but stopped doing so in the constituencies that we lost to the Tories in December 2019. Right at the heart of that is the understanding that work is not just about the paycheck that you get at the end of the month, although that's very important. It's about dignity. It's about self-esteem. It's about a sense of identity. It's about being part of something bigger. And I think that the Labour Party we have that in our DNA. The clue's in the word, Colin. We're called the Labour Party because we stand for working people. I think, unfortunately, in all the turbulence in our party over the last 5 or 6 years, some of that's been forgotten. So that's why it was so good to see Keir Starmer putting that theme front and centre of his speech. And we think that's a big part of how Labour begins to rebuild trust and support in the constituencies that we lost in December 2019.
There's such an opportunity here for Labour, isn't there? But for it to work, people have to be persuaded that, yes, the free market needs something within the mechanism that stops capitalism running rampant, that makes sure that people are paid properly. And the traditional mechanism for doing that in negotiations over pay and conditions has been the trades unions. But I mentioned the Unite union there deliberately because if you look at that union, there's a union with a leader who's talked about sailing pretty close to the edge of what the law permits in terms of industrial disputes. Somebody who said in the past they are prepared to look at, for instance, the idea of protesting outside somebody's home, a boss's home. And you can see how you would, while supporting the unions and encouraging them to play a constructive role in negotiating good jobs, that quite quickly, if you're not careful, we get a return to that old 1970s-style militancy that did so much harm to the Labour movement.
It's vital that the Labour Party is a bridge between business and trade unions. I think there's a real role for us to play with a very responsible and serious leader such as Keir Starmer and outstanding people like Rachel Reeves in the cabinet who really understand what the private sector is looking for, to actually say, you know, there's a great opportunity here for business leaders who get it, who want to have more sustainable growth models, who want to have a happy and productive workforce, to actually engage constructively with trade unions. And when that constructive engagement comes from the side of business, I think it will be matched from the side of the trade unions. At the moment, for years now, we've had something of a dialogue of the death, frankly, which started under Thatcher in the 1980s, where there was a clear attempt to kind of smash the trade unions and the role, and the pendulum just swung too far. And what we need now is to get around the table and to recognise that in this new world that we live in, where we were standing on the doorsteps clapping for key workers, and many of those key workers work in the private sector. This is not just about the public sector. Let's actually turn that into something real for working people. And I think the Labour Party can and should be playing a bridging role between business and the trade union movement. I think we can really help to move our society and our economy forward on that basis.
We'll just let the economy to one side for a second and look at another aspect of what your group looked into and concluded, which is that just as the Tories were forever banging on about Europe, there's a feeling sometimes in the electorate that Labour's now forever banging on about the culture wars. And I suppose the problem you've got is, I know you're probably about to tell me, well, we'll just talk about it less, but it just doesn't work that way, does it, in the culture wars? If it's just too binary. You know, you're either with Rosie Duffield or you're a Ginner. You're either going to, as Keir Starmer did alongside Angela Rayner, take the knee in support of Black Lives Matter, or you're not going to. You have to make a choice.
Yes, I think that we have to do so, but with a very clear understanding that the United Kingdom, there are pockets of racism in the United Kingdom, there are pockets of misogyny, there are pockets of homophobia. But the United Kingdom, the British people, are not racist or misogynistic or homophobic people. The world really has moved on. And one of the most interesting and uplifting parts of the conversations we had with these 60 former voters was how little the culture wars actually were raised. And they weren't really connected to any particular political party. There were a few people sort of saying, we don't think that we should not watch certain sitcoms from the 1970s because, now that kind of humor wouldn't really work, but it was of their time. There were people talking about that kind of, what is our culture? What do we find amusing or whatever it might be? But they were saying politics shouldn't really get involved in those conversations. It's not up to us as politicians to micromanage what people think is funny or not funny or acceptable in certain circles.
Stephen, do I take it from that?
On all of these issues, I think we should stay out of that and stick to the bread and butter issue.
Do I take it from that you think it was a mistake for Keir Starmer to take the knee in his office in the way he did and be pictured like that?
No, I don't, because I think when you look at the way in which the England football team, for example, and in fact Premier League players and teams such as the one I support, the Welsh football team as well, do it. There's a very strong sense in the country that we as a nation benefit from that diversity, and that diversity and anti-racist sentiment, which is, I think, fundamental to the British character, should be celebrated. But it's also about following the recommendations of my own report. Colin, you'll be amazed to hear that I want to do that, which is that we need to stick to the bread and butter issues. And what we found that really did work in terms of rebuilding trust and support for Labour is about talking about jobs you can raise a family on, about invest to save so that we're sensible managers of the public finances, and about building a Britain that can stand on its own 2 feet, rebuilding our manufacturing industries. That's what the British people want from Labour, and that's what we need to start getting back to, and not being distracted by issues which, frankly, do not come up on the doorstep in my Aberavon constituency.
Stephen Kinnock, one final thought just before you go. I want to play our viewers pictures they may not have seen of Michael Gove being hounded in Whitehall. I think actually not necessarily Whitehall, but somewhere in central London, I believe, today. We're seeing this more and more, and it's those, everybody's holding up cameras, everybody's filming everybody else, but it's clearly an uncomfortable experience for a minister, for an MP, for anyone. Your thoughts?
It's disgraceful. There is a place for protest in our democracy. It's very important that the people have the right to protest, but protest should never tip over into intimidation and threats of violence and aggression. And frankly, when you consider the appalling events of what took place on Friday, it just beggars belief that these people running towards Michael Gove and shouting at him and intimidating him, what goes through their heads that they think that they could or should be able to do this at any time? But when you consider what happened tragically to my former colleague, Sir David Amess, it is completely unacceptable. I pay tribute to the police for taking such rapid action, but I think we need to really sit and think very carefully about how our democracy is working, and how many people seem to think that they can just take matters into their own hands and bully and intimidate, rather than actually try to persuade and engage in a democratic manner.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.